I thought to myself, Islam is a lie. Islam is a danger. I got over 2,000 death threats. And in the end, I decided to write an anti-Islam book.
Joram van Klaveren adalah penulis buku anti-Islam yang kini menjadi mualaf. Sebelumnya, dia telah menjadi seorang anggota parlemen Belanda. Kala itu, dia dikenal sebagai kritikus Islam yang penuh kebencian. Tangan kanan politisi Islamofobia Geert Wilders. Belakangan ia mendapat hidayah dan masuk Islam. Dia adalah pendiri Islam Experience Center, museum Islam pertama di Belanda. Lelaki kelahiran tahun 1979 di Amsterdam ini mengaku dari keluarga Calvinis yang taat dan telah tertarik pada sistem kepercayaan yang berbeda sejak masa mudanya.
Is that I believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. Yeah, in a more philosophical way, I believed he was God himself, of course. I believed in the resurrection and crucifixion of Christ, of course. And I believed in the atonement. But because the Trinity is a very complex concept, whether you believe it or not, it's still very complex. Because if there is a God in the Bible, it says God is eternal. But if you are eternal and you die, you cannot be eternal, immortal at the same time. So that was something when I was a little older, 16, 17, I started questioning things like that. It's not very logical. I talked to many priests, preachers, even rabbis, and the answers I got weren't very satisfying.
Pada saat dia mulai kuliah sambil mencari jawaban atas pertanyaannya tentang agama Kristen, Klaveren mengatakan saat itulah serangan teroris 11 September 2001 terjadi.
How and why did you decide to write an anti-Islamic book?
After high school, I went to university and I did comparative religion. And the remarkable thing, I think, was that the first day of me going to college was September 11, 2001. Already thought, okay, these Muslim guys are kind of crazy and this religion isn't the truth. Then a few years later was this guy in the Netherlands called Theo van Gogh. He was a famous filmmaker and he was killed in the street. He was shot and they tried to slit his throat and they put a knife in his stomach with a letter on it for another girl, and Ali. And it said, "You are next." So it strengthened my anti-Islam feelings in such a way that I thought, well, I have to become politically active to do something and stop this evil of harming our country.
You started politics because of Islam?
Yeah, and that really had to do with Islam. That was the reason that I wanted to write a book, to explain to people why Islam was a danger for the world.
Setelah keluar dari partai, saat menulis buku anti-Islamnya pada 2014, beberapa pertanyaan tentang kekristenan kembali muncul.
When I was writing my book, like I said earlier, the doubts I had about Christianity popped up again. And that was about truth, of course, because I was a believing Christian guy. And yeah, the Christian questions I had, in the end, were answered in an Islamic way. Because, of course, when I started writing the book, a lot of people think that it was a political book. But it wasn't so much a political book, it was a religious book, because I wanted to show people why Islam was a danger as a religion. And I wrote it from a Christian perspective. So in the beginning, I made a comparison between the Christian concept of God and the Islamic concept. So I started comparing it. But because I had these doubts about the Trinity, and I saw Tawhid, the oneness of God in Islam, I thought, yeah, it sounds a little bit more logical. And then I thought to myself, well, I reread the Bible to refresh myself, and see, okay, why isn't the concept of Islam, the Tawhid concept, isn't the Christian concept? But when I was reading the Old Testament and I saw what the Old Testament prophet said, it was one God, one God, one God. And then I thought, okay, I'll look only at the words of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. And then there's this story in the New Testament where a guy comes to Jesus and he asks him, what is the most important thing in life? How can I gain paradise? And he said there are two things. He says, "Hear, O Israel, hear your God is one. Treat your neighbor as you want to be treated yourself." So I thought, well, even Jesus Christ says, "Hear, O Israel, your God is one." So I thought, well, this whole Muslim concept of God sounds more logical, and it's the same concept that I find in the Old and the New Testament. And I know Christianity as a religion teaches something else, but it isn't the concept of God that I find in the Bible. So after weeks and weeks of study, rereading all kinds of books, I thought to myself, okay, perhaps this oneness of God is something that is true.
Saat melakukan penelitian tentang Islam, ia meminta bantuan dari akademisi Inggris Abdul Hakim Murad yang sebelumnya dikenal sebagai Timothy John, namun berganti nama setelah masuk Islam. Menggarisbawahi bahwa sebelumnya dia hanya membaca penulis barat tentang Islam, Klaveren mengatakan bahwa sebaliknya Murad menasihatinya untuk hanya membaca sumber-sumber Islam dan terdapat perbedaan yang besar. Klaveren juga mengatakan dia menyadari setelah beberapa saat bahwa Islam bukanlah kebohongan, tetapi dia masih kesulitan menerimanya. Orang-orang di sekitarnya tidak menanggapinya dengan baik kepindahannya ke Islam.
Most of them were very negative, of course. For a lot of people, especially some uncles and aunts, it was kind of a shock. They heard it when it was on the news. I told my mother, and my mother started crying. And my wife was pretty open. Yeah, she was very cool about it. She said, well, if Islam is what you really believe and that's in your heart, who am I? And yeah, some people from my old work were really aggressive. I got over 2,000 death threats from people who used to support me, of course. People who voted for me. People said the most horrible things. We will rape your wife, shoot you, we know where your children go to school, stuff like that. And most of them, of course, is nonsense because they're crazy people writing things on their computer. So it was kind of a hectic time. And I had to tell my work, of course, and it was this Christian organization. So to say, the leader of the pack, he said, I can't believe it. And he said, well, I noticed this change when you talked about certain topics on radio. You were kind of a little more mild, not so harsh anymore, but you becoming a Muslim. And after I said, yeah, I became Muslim, he said I couldn't sleep for it for 2 days. I couldn't accept it. It was so strange.
Tentang meningkatnya sentimen anti-Muslim di Eropa dalam beberapa tahun terakhir, Klaveren mengatakan salah satu hal yang memicu Islamofobia adalah media massa, menyebutkan bagaimana orang Arab dan Muslim terus-menerus ditampilkan sebagai teroris, terutama di film-film Hollywood.
I think Islam is a lie. Because that's something I used to say. Islam is a lie, the Quran is poison. But when I said Islam is a lie, that's the whole religion and everything that comes with it. So that's like the highest level of jahiliyyah in a way. Yeah, that's something I regret because it was like an umbrella and everything else was under this concept of Islam is a lie because that was the core thought. And of course, I do blame myself, and I know there are a lot of people out there not practicing Muslims that do so. And in a way, I understand it because in a political sense and in a social cultural sense, everything I said and done is still there. I sometimes even hear arguments from people in my old party that I offended in a way. Yeah, that's something that bothers me, and that's one of the reasons that we founded an organization. It's called the IXC, Islam Experience Center, and we go to schools, primary school, high school, college, universities, but also to departments of the government, other social organizations, churches, to take away misconceptions about Islam, to share the message, to show Islam in its true colors. And we do it by virtual reality with the glasses, so it's a very fun experience as well. And we try to erase in a way the things I said and done in the past.
How should people research about Islam? Do you advise just searching at Google?
No, I would certainly not advise Google. It's the last thing I would advise. I said shut down the computer. No, I think it's very important that people read books, real books with pages and stuff. I would recommend Muhammad, His Life Based on the Earlier Sources of Martin Links, the book I talked about earlier. It's a green book. And I think it's very important for people not just dive into the Quran because it's a very complex book. And if you don't have anybody who can teach you what you read, especially most of the people who don't know anything about Islam are not fluent Arabic, classic Arabic speaking people. So you will read an interpretation of the Quran or a translation, and most of the time that's not the real deal, of course. So I would advise people just to study the Sirat, study the character and the life of the Prophet, because that's what the tradition teaches us as well. His life was the Quran. He was the living Quran in a way. Just study his Sunnah, and I think that is the best way of discovering Islam.